Desert Lonely Shadow. May Cassidy had spent 10 years trying to forget Jesse Coulter, the outlaw who broke her heart and disappeared into the dust. But when he rode into town scarred, dangerous, and staring straight at her, she knew the past wasn't done with her yet. He leaned against the saloon door, his voice a low drawl. "Didn't think I'd come back, did you, darlin'?" he murmured. "Reckon I've got unfinished business." Chapter 1. A Decade in Dust. The wind, a restless spirit itself, whipped through Harmony Creek, carrying with it the fine, red dust that coated everything, the weathered wood of the buildings, the sparse, tenacious vegetation, and the deep lines etched into May Cassidy's face. 10 years. 10 years since Jesse Coulter had ridden out of her life, leaving behind a shattered heart and a silence so profound it had become a part of her. She traced the rim of her chipped enamel mug, the lukewarm coffee long forgotten, her gaze fixed on the dusty main street. The same street where she'd last seen him, a silhouette against the setting sun, his eyes holding a promise he never intended to keep. May ran a hand through her hair, the once vibrant auburn now streaked with silver, a testament to the years and the hardships they'd brought. She'd kept the Cassidy ranch running, a task that had seemed insurmountable after her father's passing, just months after Jesse's departure. The ranch was her life, her legacy, a connection to a past that was both a comfort and a constant ache. She'd learned to be strong, to be self-reliant, to bury the vulnerability that Jesse had once so effortlessly unearthed. The rhythmic creak of the porch swing was a familiar counterpoint to the wind's mournful song. Her old dog, Blue, a grizzled heeler mix, lay at her feet, his one good eye following her every move with a loyalty that was both comforting and heartbreaking. He was a pup when Jesse left. Now he was old, his muzzle gray, his step slow. Time, it seemed, marched on relentlessly, even in this forgotten corner of the world. The bell above the general store across the street jingled, announcing a customer. May glanced up, her eyes automatically scanning the street, a habit born of years of living on the edge of the frontier. This wasn't a place for the faint of heart. Outlaws, rustlers, and the occasional desperate soul seeking refuge, Harmony Creek saw them all. And yet it was home. She'd built a life here, a respectable, if solitary, existence. She was Miss Cassidy to the townsfolk, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering integrity. She paid her taxes, helped her neighbors, and kept to herself. The wild, impulsive girl who dared to love an outlaw was buried deep, hidden beneath layers of practicality and a carefully constructed facade of composure. But beneath the surface, the embers of that old love still smoldered. She hadn't forgotten the way his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, could hold her captive. She hadn't forgotten the feel of his calloused hand in hers, the rough tenderness of his touch. She hadn't forgotten the promises whispered under a blanket of stars, promises that had evaporated like morning mist. May sighed, the sound lost in the wind. She'd convinced herself that she'd moved on, that she'd found peace in her solitude. But the truth was, a part of her had remained frozen in time, waiting, yearning, for a resolution that would likely never come. He was an outlaw, a ghost, a figment of a past that should have faded with the years. A sudden commotion down the street drew her attention. A group of riders, their horses kicking up a cloud of dust, were approaching the town. May narrowed her eyes, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle leaning against the porch railing. It was always wise to be cautious. Strangers were rarely a welcome sight in Harmony Creek. As they drew closer, she could make out the details, hard-faced men, their clothes dusty and worn, their eyes scanning the town with a predatory intensity. They weren't locals, and there was something about their demeanor, a swagger, a barely contained violence, that sent a shiver of unease down her spine. Blue growled low in his throat, his ears pricked, his old body tense. He sensed it too, the danger that rode in with the dust and the wind. May stood up, her hand firmly gripping the rifle, her eyes fixed on the approaching riders. She'd faced down challenges before. She'd survived hardship and heartbreak. She would face whatever this was, with the same quiet determination that had seen her through the last 10 years. But as the lead rider came to a halt in front of the saloon, his horse rearing slightly, May's breath caught in her throat. The years had changed him, etched lines of hardship onto his face, added a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, but she'd recognize him anywhere. The stormy eyes, the set of his jaw, the way he sat his horse with an effortless grace that bordered on arrogance. It was Jesse. He had changed, had hardened, but the core that she had fallen for had remained unchanged. She was staring at a ghost, the phantom of her past, a decade in the making. Chapter 2. The Shadow Returns. He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied the years and the miles that must have separated them. The dust swirled around him, momentarily obscuring him, like a phantom emerging from the mists of time. Then, the wind shifted, and he stood there, bathed in the harsh afternoon sunlight, more real, more dangerous than any memory she had conjured. Jesse Coulter. The name echoed in her mind, a silent scream against the sudden, deafening roar in her ears. He hadn't aged in the way she had. While her body bore the subtle marks of time and toil, his seemed to have been honed by it, sharpened into something harder, more formidable. The boyish charm she remembered was gone, replaced by a chilling composure, a weariness that spoke of a life lived on the edge. His clothes were worn, the leather of his chaps and vest bearing the scars of countless rides. A gun belt, low-slung and heavy with the weight of a Colt peacemaker, rested on his hip. He looked every bit the outlaw she'd always known he was, and yet, something in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, held her captive. He hadn't seen her yet. He was surveying the town, his gaze sweeping across the buildings, the faces of the few people who had ventured out onto the street, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The other riders, his men, remained mounted, their hands resting on their rifles, their eyes mirroring their leader's caution. May remained frozen, her hand still gripping the rifle, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to disappear back into the life she had so carefully constructed. But she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, drawn to him by a force she couldn't explain, a force that had defied time and distance. Then his gaze found hers. It was like a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. His eyes, those stormy gray eyes that had once held such tenderness, now held a mixture of surprise, recognition, and something else, something that sent a shiver of both fear and anticipation down her spine. He held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken words, with the weight of the past. Then a slow smile, a ghost of the smile she remembered, touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. He pushed open the batwing doors of the saloon, the sound echoing through the sudden quiet of the street. His men followed him, their spurs jingling on the wooden floorboards, their presence filling the space with a palpable tension. May lowered the rifle, her hand trembling. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the protective walls she had built around herself had crumbled to dust at the mere sight of him. She wanted to turn away, to retreat back into the safety of her home, but her feet seemed rooted to the porch. He was back. Jesse Coulter, the outlaw, the ghost, the man who had stolen her heart and shattered it into a million pieces, had returned. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life, the quiet, predictable life she had so painstakingly created, was about to change forever. He turned to look at her as he entered the saloon, his eyes meeting hers one final time, the distance closing only in spirit. Chapter 3. Unspoken Words, Unfading Scars. The saloon, usually a haven of boisterous noise and drunken camaraderie, fell silent as Jesse and his men entered. The clinking of glasses ceased, the murmur of conversations died, and all eyes turned towards the newcomers. The air, thick with the smell of stale beer, tobacco smoke, and unwashed bodies, seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. May watched from the porch, her heart a heavy weight in her chest. She could feel the stares of the townsfolk, their curious, questioning glances. They knew. They all knew the story of May Cassidy and the outlaw, Jesse Coulter. It was a legend whispered in hushed tones, a cautionary tale of love and loss. She forced herself to breathe, to regain some semblance of composure. She wouldn't let him see her fear, her vulnerability. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She had spent 10 years building a wall around her heart, and she wouldn't let him breach it so easily. But even as she steeled herself, she couldn't deny the tremor of anticipation that ran through her. She wanted to know why he was back. What unfinished business had brought him back to Harmony Creek, back to her? Inside the saloon, Jesse leaned against the bar, his back to the room, his gaze fixed on the dusty bottles lining the shelves. He could feel the weight of the stares, the unspoken questions. He knew what they were thinking. He was the prodigal son, the outlaw returned, the shadow that had haunted this town for a decade. He ordered a whiskey, his voice a low drawl that cut through the silence. The bartender, a burly man named Silas, who had known Jesse since he was a boy, poured the drink with a steady hand, his eyes betraying a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Didn't expect to see you back here, Jesse," Silas said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Jesse took a long swallow of the whiskey, the fiery liquid burning a trail down his throat. "Reckon I had some things to take care of," he replied, his voice noncommittal. "Things?" Silas raised an eyebrow, his gaze flickering towards the window, towards May standing on the porch. Jesse followed his gaze, his expression unreadable. He saw her standing there, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, her rifle still clutched in her hand. She looked strong, resilient, even more beautiful than he remembered. The years had etched lines of character onto her face, but they hadn't diminished the fire in her eyes. He turned back to Silas, a flicker of something that might have been regret crossing his face. "Old debts," he said, his voice low. "Promises unkept." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Silas knew. Everyone in Harmony Creek knew. The story of Jesse and May was as much a part of the town's history as the dusty streets and the weathered buildings. Jesse finished his whiskey, the glass clinking softly on the bar. He could feel May's gaze on him, burning through the wooden walls of the saloon. He knew he had to talk to her, to explain, to apologize, or perhaps to do something else entirely. He pushed himself away from the bar, his movements deliberate, his eyes fixed on the door. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He knew he had hurt her, broken her trust. He knew he had a lot to answer for. He stepped outside, leaving his men in the dim recess, moving into the brightness to face the music of his past. The sun seemed to halt and linger as their eyes met. Chapter 4. Whispers of the Past. The afternoon sun beat down on Harmony Creek, turning the dust to a shimmering haze. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. May watched Jesse approach, his steps slow and deliberate, his shadows stretching long and distorted across the dusty street. He stopped a few feet from the porch, his eyes searching hers. He looked older, harder, the lines around his eyes etched deeper, the scar above his eyebrow a stark reminder of the life he had chosen. But there was something else in his gaze, a vulnerability, a weariness that she hadn't expected. "May," he said, his voice a low rumble, the sound of it sending a shiver down her spine. It was the first time he had spoken her name in 10 years, and the sound of it, raw and familiar, chipped away at the carefully constructed wall around her heart. She didn't reply, her gaze unwavering, her hand still resting on the rifle, a silent barrier between them. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, to unleash the torrent of anger and hurt that had been building inside her for a decade. But the words caught in her throat, trapped by a knot of emotions she couldn't untangle. "I know I have no right to be here," he continued, his voice rough with sincerity. "But I needed to see you."
"Why?"
The word escaped her lips, a whispered rasp, barely audible above the buzzing of insects and the distant whinny of a horse. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, towards the distant mountains that ringed the town.
"There are things you don't know, May."
"Things I couldn't tell you then." "Things?" Her voice was stronger now, laced with a bitterness that surprised even her. You left, Jesse. You rode away without a word, without a backward glance. You left me to pick up the pieces of a life you shattered. His eyes snapped back to hers, a flicker of pain crossing his face. I know, he said, his voice barely a whisper. And I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I need you to understand. Understand? She laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. Understand what, Jesse? That you're an outlaw? That you broke your promises? That you broke my heart? He flinched, as if her words were physical blows. It wasn't that simple. May, he said, his voice tight with emotion. There were complications. Complications? She stepped down from the porch, closing the distance between them, her anger simmering beneath the surface. What complications could possibly justify what you did? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something else, something that looked like desperation. I can't tell you here, he said, his gaze flickering towards the town, towards the curious eyes that were watching them from every window and doorway. It's not safe. Not safe.
She scoffed.
You're the one who brought danger back to Harmony Creek, Jesse. You and your men. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out towards her, then stopping, hovering in the air between them. Please, May, he said, his voice pleading.
Just let me explain.
Meet me.
Tonight.
At the old oak tree. By the creek. The old oak tree. The place where they had shared their first kiss, where they had whispered their promises, where they had dreamed of a future that would never be. The place where her heart had been broken. A hawk cried loudly above, circling lazily, as their conversation hung suspended in the heavy afternoon air. Chapter 5. The Price of Freedom. The thought of meeting him, of revisiting that place, sent a wave of conflicting emotions through her. Anger, hurt, resentment, but also a flicker of something else, something she had thought long dead. Curiosity, a desperate need to understand, to finally have the answers she had craved for a decade. Why should I? She asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to control it. Why should I trust you? He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. You shouldn't, he said, his voice honest and raw. But I'm asking you to. Just this once.
Give me a chance to explain.
She hesitated, her mind warring with her heart. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to turn away, to protect herself from the pain he had caused her. But the look in his eyes, the desperation in his voice, held her captive. Tonight, she said, the word barely a whisper. But if you're lying to me, Jesse, if this is some kind of trick, he shook his head.
No tricks, Mai.
I swear it. Just please. Meet me. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked back towards the saloon, his men falling into step behind him. May watched them go, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had agreed to meet him, to risk opening old wounds, to face the man who had broken her heart. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't know if she could trust him. But she knew she had to go. She had to hear his explanation, even if it was just another lie. She had to find some kind of closure, some way to finally put the past to rest. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, May returned to her chores, her mind preoccupied with the upcoming meeting. She fed the chickens, milked the cow, and prepared a simple supper, her movements automatic, her thoughts miles away. She tried to focus on the present, on the tangible realities of her life, but her mind kept returning to Jesse, to the look in his eyes, to the unspoken words that hung between them. She wondered what he had been involved in, what complications had forced him to leave. She wondered if he had ever thought of her, if he had ever regretted his decision. The price of freedom, she realized, was often paid in heartache. She had found her freedom, her independence, in the years since he had left. But it had come at a cost. And now, he was back, threatening to shatter the fragile peace she had so carefully constructed. She wondered if he had found his, and at what price that freedom was gained. The chickens clucked their usual nighttime warnings as she closed the coop door, her mind miles away in the darkening shadows of the approaching meeting. Chapter 6. Beneath a blazing sky. The moon, A sliver of silver in the vast, inky sky cast a pale glow over the landscape. The air was cool, a welcome relief from the scorching heat of the day. May wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, the familiar weight of it both comforting and constricting. She walked slowly, her boots crunching on the dry earth, her heart pounding a steady rhythm against her ribs. The old oak tree stood sentinel on the bank of the creek, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. It was a place of memories, of whispered secrets and stolen kisses. A place where she had once felt safe, loved, and free. Now it felt like a battleground, a place where the past and the present were about to collide. He was already there. Jesse leaned against the trunk of the tree, his silhouette dark against the moonlit landscape. He was watching her approach, his posture tense, his eyes unreadable in the shadows. He didn't speak, didn't move, as she drew closer. May stopped a few feet from him, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken emotions. She could hear the gentle murmur of the creek, the rustling of leaves in the night breeze, the frantic beat of her own heart. "You came," he said, his voice low, a hint of surprise in his tone. "I said I would," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She wouldn't let him see her weakness, her vulnerability. He pushed himself away from the tree, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked tired, the lines of hardship etched deeper into his face in the moonlight. The scar above his eyebrow seemed to stand out more prominently, a stark reminder of the life he had lived. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for giving me this chance." "I haven't given you anything yet, Jesse," she said, her voice cool. "I'm here to listen. That's all." He nodded, his gaze searching hers.
Fair enough, he said.
"But before I tell you anything I need you to know, I never wanted to leave you, May. Not the way I did." Her breath caught in her throat. The words, spoken with such raw honesty, chipped away at the icy armor she had built around her heart.
"Then why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, towards the dark, flowing water of the creek.
"It's a long story," he said. "And it's not pretty."
"I have time," she said, her voice stronger now. "And I've seen my share of ugly." He took a deep breath, then began to speak, his voice low and steady, the words tumbling out like a confession long overdue. He told her about the gang he had fallen in with, about the robberies, the raids, the life of violence and desperation he had led. He told her about the men he had ridden with, the choices he had made, the mistakes he had regretted. He told her about the night he left, about the raid that had gone wrong, about the men who had died, about the price on his head. He told her that he had left to protect her, to keep her safe from the consequences of his actions. He'd been looking out for her, trying to make up for an error that could cost him his life, and hers. May listened in silence, her heart aching with each word, each revelation. She had imagined 1,000 scenarios, 1,000 reasons for his departure, but none of them had come close to the truth. The sky overhead seemed to burn a brighter blue as he spoke, and the weight of his confession settled between them. Chapter 7. Riders in the Storm. He spoke of a betrayal, a double cross by someone he had trusted, someone within his own gang. He had been set up, framed for a crime he hadn't committed, a murder that had carried a hefty reward. He had fled, not just from the law, but from his own men, the men he had once considered brothers. "I had to disappear, May," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I had to get away from them, from everything. If I had stayed, they would have killed me. And they might have come after you, too." She understood then, the fear in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. He hadn't abandoned her, he had been running for his life. He had been trying to protect her, in his own twisted, outlaw way. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Why didn't you trust me?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I couldn't risk it, May," he said. "I didn't know who to trust. And I didn't want to put you in danger. You were better off without me." "Better off?" She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Do you have any idea what I went through? The pain, the humiliation, the endless questions?" He flinched, as if her words were physical blows. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry, May." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to forgive him. But the years of hurt, the ingrained distrust, were hard to overcome. "Why are you back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What is it you want?" He took a step closer, his hand reaching out towards her, then stopping, hovering in the air between them. "I came back to clear my name," he said, his voice firm. "To find the man who betrayed me. And I came back for you, May. I never stopped loving you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken longing, with the weight of the past. May's heart pounded against her ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm. She wanted to believe him, to fall into his arms, to recapture the love they had once shared. But fear, a cold, paralyzing fear, held her back. Suddenly, the sound of approaching horses shattered the stillness of the night. A group of riders, their silhouettes dark against the moonlit landscape, were galloping towards them. Jesse's eyes widened in alarm. "Damn it," he muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. "They found me." He pushed May behind him, shielding her with his body. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. "And don't make a sound." The riders were closing in fast, their horses' hooves pounding the earth, their shouts echoing through the night. May crouched behind the oak tree, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind racing. She was trapped, caught in the crossfire of Jesse's past. The approaching riders raised their weapons, firing quickly and accurately, as they raced towards the couple beneath the tree. Chapter 8. Secrets of the Saloon. The riders reined in their horses a short distance away, their faces obscured by the shadows, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. May recognized the leader, a tall, lean man with a cruel smile and eyes that glittered with malice. It was Bart, the man Jesse had spoken of, the man who had betrayed him. Well, Bart drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what we have here. The prodigal son returns." Jesse stood his ground, his hand resting on his gun, his body shielding May. "Bart," he said, his voice cold and steady. "I should have known you'd be behind this." Bart laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You always were too trusting, Jesse," he said. "A fatal flaw in our line of work." "What do you want, Bart?" Jesse asked, his eyes narrowed. "What do I want?" Bart chuckled. "I want what's rightfully mine. The reward money. And you, Jesse. Dead or alive? Preferably dead." May peeked out from behind Jesse, her heart pounding. She saw the other riders, their faces hard and unforgiving, their guns trained on Jesse. They were outnumbered, outgunned. She knew that if a fight broke out, they wouldn't stand a chance. "There's no need for this, Bart," Jesse said, his voice calm, but his eyes betraying a hint of desperation. "Let us go, and I'll disappear. You'll never see me again." Bart laughed again. "You think I'm stupid, Jesse? You think I'd let you walk away? You know too much. You're a liability." "I won't talk," Jesse said, his voice firm. "I swear it." "Your word means nothing, Jesse," Bart said, his voice cold. "You're an outlaw, a liar, and a thief. And now, you're a dead man." He raised his hand, signaling his men to fire. May closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But the shot never came. Instead, a voice, clear and strong, cut through the night. "Drop your weapons, Bart." May opened her eyes, her heart leaping with surprise and relief. It was Sheriff Thompson, the lawman of Harmony Creek, standing at the edge of the clearing, his rifle aimed at Bart. Behind him stood a group of armed townsmen, their faces grim, their expressions determined. Bart hesitated, his eyes darting from Sheriff Thompson to Jesse, then back again. He was clearly surprised, caught off guard. "Sheriff," he said, his voice losing some of its bravado. "This ain't your concern." "It is now," Sheriff Thompson said, his voice firm. "I've heard enough. I know about the reward, Bart. And I know you're the one who killed Miller. Not Jesse." Bart's face paled. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Sheriff Thompson asked. "We'll see what the judge has to say about that. Now, drop your weapons. All of you." Bart's men hesitated, looking at their leader for guidance. Bart himself seemed to deflate, his shoulders slumping, his bravado crumbling. He knew he was beaten. He knew he couldn't fight the entire town. He slowly placed his pistol into the holster. The tension seemed to drain out of the scene, and peace of the night returned. Chapter 9. Blood on the Horizon. Bart lowered his gun, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and defeat. His men, seeing their leader surrender, followed suit, reluctantly dropping their weapons. Sheriff Thompson and the townsmen approached, cautiously, their rifles still trained on the outlaws. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Bart said, his voice tight with anger. "You're siding with the criminal." "I'm siding with the truth, Bart," Sheriff Thompson replied, his voice unwavering. "And the truth is, you're the criminal here. You framed Jesse, you murdered Miller, and you've been terrorizing this town for long enough." He turned to his men. "Take them away," he ordered, "and lock them up. We'll let the judge sort this out." The townsmen disarmed Bart and his gang, binding their hands and leading them away, their horses following behind. May watched them go, her heart still pounding, her mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. Jesse turned to Sheriff Thompson, his expression a mixture of gratitude and surprise. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said. "I owe you one." Sheriff Thompson nodded, his gaze shifting to May. "I did what was right," he said. "And I know you're not a bad man, Jesse. You just made some bad choices. We all get choices, and they often define us. Make good choices and surround yourself with good men." He paused, then added, "I heard your story, Jesse. From May. She told me everything." May blushed, her gaze meeting Jesse's. She hadn't expected the sheriff to reveal that she had been the one to intervene. She had acted on instinct, driven by a desperate need to save him, to protect him, even after everything he had done. Jesse looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that looked like love. "You did that?" he asked, his voice soft. "You saved me?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She had risked her own safety, her own reputation, to help him. She had chosen to believe him, to trust him, even when she had every reason not to. Sheriff Thompson cleared his throat. "I'll leave you two alone," he said. "But Jesse, you're a free man. For now. But I suggest you stay out of trouble. And you, May," he turned back to her, a glimmer of a smile in his eyes. "You keep him in line." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving May and Jesse alone under the vast, starlit sky. The silence stretched between them, no longer heavy with unspoken words, but filled with a new understanding, a new beginning. Jesse took a step closer to May, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why did you do it, May? After everything I put you through?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Because I still love you, Jesse," she whispered. "I never stopped." The words hung in the air, a confession, a promise, a testament to the enduring power of love. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if he would never let her go. And under the blood-red horizon of the rising sun, they kissed, a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that promised a future, finally, together. The cool air of the night whispered that a new day would soon be upon them. Chapter 10. The Dance of Deception. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Bart and his men were held in the town's makeshift jail, awaiting the arrival of the circuit judge. Jesse, cleared of the murder charge, was still viewed with suspicion by some of the townsfolk, but May's unwavering support and Sheriff Thompson's endorsement helped to ease the tension. Jesse stayed at the ranch with May, sleeping in the barn, helping with the chores, slowly integrating himself back into her life. It wasn't easy. There were awkward silences, unspoken questions, and the lingering shadow of the past hanging between them. But there were also moments of tenderness, of shared laughter, of rediscovered connection. May found herself falling in love with him all over again, but this time, it was a different kind of love. It wasn't the blind, impulsive passion of her youth, but a deeper, more mature affection, tempered by the knowledge of his flaws, his mistakes, and his capacity for both good and evil. Jesse, too, seemed to be a changed man. He was quieter, more thoughtful, less reckless. He seemed determined to prove himself, to earn May's trust, to make amends for the pain he had caused her. He worked tirelessly on the ranch, his hands, once accustomed to holding a gun, now skilled at mending fences, tending livestock, and repairing the weathered buildings. But beneath the surface, there were still secrets, still unresolved issues. Jesse was still searching for the evidence that would definitively prove his innocence, evidence that would expose Bart's treachery and clear his name once and for all. He spent hours poring over old wanted posters, questioning the few remaining members of his former gang who hadn't been arrested, and searching for clues that might lead him to the truth. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, May noticed a flicker of unease in Jesse's eyes. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. "What's troubling you?" He hesitated, then said, "I think Bart had an accomplice. Someone on the inside. Someone who helped him set me up." May's heart sank. She had hoped that Bart's arrest would be the end of it, that they could finally move on, put the past behind them. But it seemed that the shadows of Jesse's former life were still reaching out to claim him. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jesse shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "But I'm going to find out. I have to." He looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "I won't let this hang over us, May," he said. "I promise you. I'll clear my name, and then we can finally be together. Without fear. Without secrets." She nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She knew that Jesse's quest for the truth was a dangerous one, that it could lead him back into the darkness he had so narrowly escaped. But she also knew that she couldn't stop him. She wouldn't stop him. She would support him, stand by him, no matter what. She placed her hand in his, and they leaned against each other as the colors of the sunset swirled above. Chapter 11. Echoes of Betrayal. Jesse's investigation led him back to the saloon, the place where it had all begun, the place where he had first met Bart and his gang. He spent hours there, talking to the regulars, questioning the bartender, Silas, trying to piece together the puzzle of his betrayal. Silas, who had known Jesse since he was a boy, was initially reluctant to talk, wary of getting involved in outlaw business. But Jesse's persistence and his genuine desire for justice eventually wore him down. "There was a stranger," Silas said, his voice low, his eyes darting around the room, as if he were afraid of being overheard. "Came in a few weeks before the raid. A slick-talking fella, with money to burn.
He was asking questions about you, Jesse.
About your plans. Did you get a name?" Jesse asked, his heart pounding. Silas shook his head. "Didn't give one," he said. "But I remember he had a distinctive scar. On his left hand. Shaped like a crescent moon. A crescent moon." The image flashed in Jesse's mind, a long-forgotten memory surfacing from the depths of his past. He knew that scar. He had seen it before. He remembered a man, a gambler, he had met years ago, in a dusty saloon in a forgotten town. A man with a smooth tongue and a cold, calculating gaze. A man with a crescent moon scar on his left hand. The man's name was Silas. The realization hit Jesse like a physical blow. The air rushed from his lungs, and for a moment, the world seemed to spin around him. Silas, the kindly bartender, the man who had known him since he was a boy, the man he had trusted, was the one who had betrayed him. He stared at Silas, his eyes filled with disbelief, with anger, with a profound sense of betrayal. "You," he said, his voice barely a whisper.
"It was you."
Silas's face paled. He tried to deny it, to stammer out an excuse, but the look in Jesse's eyes, the knowledge of the truth, silenced him.
"Why?"
Jesse asked, his voice trembling with rage. "Why did you do it, Silas?" Silas looked away, his gaze fixed on the dusty floorboards. "Money," he said, his voice low and ashamed. "Bart offered me a share of the reward. I needed the money, Jesse. I was in debt. Up to my eyeballs. So you sold me out?" Jesse's voice was filled with disgust. You betrayed me for money? Silas didn't reply. He couldn't meet Jesse's gaze. He knew he had done wrong. He knew he had betrayed a friend. He knew he had shattered a trust that could never be repaired. Jesse turned and walked away, his heart heavy with a mixture of anger and sadness. He had found his betrayer, but the victory felt hollow, empty. The truth had come at a cost, the cost of a friendship, the cost of an illusion. He now knew who had betrayed him, but the knowledge only made the weight of his actions heavier. His confrontation and his realization remained secret as the night drew in. Chapter 12. The Heart's Reckoning. May was waiting for him on the porch, her face etched with worry. She had seen the look in his eyes when he left the saloon, the darkness that had settled over him. She knew that something had happened, something significant. What is it? She asked, her voice soft, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. What did you find out? He told her everything. He told her about Silas, about the crescent moon scar, about the betrayal that had cut him deeper than any bullet wound. He told her about the years of trust, shattered in an instant, by greed and desperation. May listened in silence, her heart aching for him. She had seen the toll that Jesse's past had taken on him, the weight of the secrets he had carried. She had hoped that finding the truth would bring him peace, but it seemed that it had only opened up new wounds. I'm sorry, Jesse, she said, her voice filled with compassion. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. It's not your fault, May, he said. It's mine. I trusted the wrong people. I made the wrong choices. We all make mistakes, Jesse, she said, her hand gently stroking his cheek. It's what we do afterwards that matters. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment, as if he were drawing strength from her presence. I don't know what to do, May, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I don't know how to move on from this. You're not alone, Jesse, she said, her voice firm. You have me, and you have a chance to start over, to build a new life, a better life. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Do you really believe that? He asked. After everything I've done? I do, she said, her voice unwavering. I believe in you, Jesse. I believe in the good in you. I always have. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. I love you, May, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I don't deserve you, but I love you. And I love you, Jesse, she replied, her voice filled with a love that had endured the test of time, a love that had survived betrayal and heartbreak, a love that was stronger than ever. They stood there, embraced in the soft glow of the moonlight, their hearts beating as one. The past was still there, a shadow that would always linger, but it no longer held them captive. They had faced the truth, together, and they had found a way forward, a path towards healing, towards redemption, towards a future filled with hope. The weight of the past was heavy, but together they would carry it, side by side into the dawning of a new day and a new life together. Chapter 13. A Gathering Storm. The news of Silas's betrayal spread through Harmony Creek like wildfire. The townsfolk, who had once viewed him as a harmless, if somewhat gruff, fixture of the community, were shocked and dismayed. Sheriff Thompson, acting on Jesse's information, arrested Silas, adding him to the growing list of prisoners awaiting the judge's arrival. Jesse, despite having found the man who had betrayed him, felt no sense of satisfaction, no sense of closure. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too personal. He had trusted Silas, had considered him a friend, and that trust had been shattered, irrevocably. He spent his days working on the ranch, trying to lose himself in the physical labor, trying to forget the pain and the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. But the nights were harder. Sleep eluded him, his dreams haunted by images of the past, by the faces of the men he had ridden with, by the betrayal that had changed his life forever. May watched him, her heart aching for him. She knew that he was struggling, that he was battling demons she couldn't fully comprehend. She tried to comfort him, to offer him solace, but she knew that ultimately, He had to find his own way through the darkness. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, the air thick with the smell of rain and dust, Jesse stood on the porch, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. The wind whipped around him, tugging at his clothes, mirroring the turmoil within him. May came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her head on his back. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice soft. He didn't reply for a moment, then said, "I'm thinking about leaving, May." Her heart clenched. "Leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Leaving Harmony Creek? Leaving me?" He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I can't stay here, May," he said. "Not anymore. There are too many ghosts, too many memories." "But what about us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What about the life we were going to build together?" He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "I love you, May," he said, "more than anything. But I need to find some peace. I need to find myself. And I can't do that here." Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. She understood. She knew that he needed to go, that he needed to find his own path. But the thought of losing him again, of being alone again, was almost unbearable. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. He shrugged.
"I don't know," he said.
"West, maybe. Somewhere new. Somewhere where nobody knows my name." The first drops of rain began to fall, splattering on the porch roof, mixing with her tears. The wind howled, a mournful sound that echoed the ache in her heart. The storm had broken, both outside and within. The sky cracked with lightning, temporarily illuminating the tears streaming down May's face. Chapter 14. Crossroads of Fate. May clung to him, her body shaking with sobs. "Don't go, Jesse," she pleaded.
"Please, don't leave me again."
He held her tight, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I have to, May," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's the only way. For both of us." "But I love you," she cried. "And you love me. Isn't that enough?" "It's not that simple, May," he said. "I have to make things right. I have to find some kind of redemption. And I can't do that here, with the shadow of my past hanging over me." He kissed her then, a long, passionate kiss that tasted of salt and rain and desperation. It was a kiss goodbye, a kiss that acknowledged the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. He pulled away, his eyes searching hers. "I'll come back for you, May," he said, his voice firm. "I promise you. When I've found what I'm looking for, when I've made peace with my past, I'll come back." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold on to that promise, to cling to the hope that he would return. But she knew that life, especially on the frontier, was unpredictable, that promises were often broken, that the future was never certain. "And if you don't?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he would ever be able to truly escape his past. He mounted his horse, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his clothes already soaked. He looked at her one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. "Goodbye, May," he said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. Then, he turned and rode away, disappearing into the darkness, into the swirling rain and wind, leaving May standing alone on the porch, her heart shattered once again. She watched him go, her body numb, her mind reeling. She had lost him again. He was gone, vanished into the storm, just as he had vanished into the dust 10 years before. But this time it was different. This time she understood. This time, she knew that he wasn't running away from her, but towards something, towards a future he desperately needed to find. And as she stood there, alone in the rain, she made a decision. She wouldn't wait for him. She wouldn't sit idly by, hoping for his return. She would live her life, her own life, on her own terms. And if he ever came back, if he ever found what he was looking for, she would be there, waiting for him. But she wouldn't wait in vain. She would live, truly live, until that day came. The rain continued its relentless downpour, washing away the tracks of his horse and blurring her tears. Chapter 15. The outlaw's plea. Weeks turned into months. The storm passed, the seasons changed, and life in Harmony Creek returned to its usual rhythm. The circuit judge arrived. Bart and his men were tried and convicted, and Silas, despite his betrayal, received a lighter sentence due to his cooperation with the authorities. May kept the ranch running, her days filled with the familiar routines of farm life. She worked hard, her hands calloused, her body strong, her spirit resilient. She had learned to be self-sufficient, to rely on her own strength, her own determination. But she never forgot Jesse. She kept his memory alive, tucked away in a corner of her heart, a bittersweet reminder of the love they had shared, the promise he had made. She often found herself gazing at the horizon, wondering where he was, what he was doing, if he was still alive. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, she saw a rider approaching in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. She squinted, her eyes straining to make out the figure, her body tensing with a mixture of hope and apprehension. It couldn't be, but it was. As he drew closer, she recognized him. Jesse. He was thinner, his face weathered, his clothes dusty and worn. But his eyes, those stormy gray eyes, held the same intensity, the same spark of something she had thought long dead. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on her. He looked tired, weary, but there was a new calmness about him, a sense of peace she hadn't seen before. May, he said, his voice a low rumble, the sound of it sending a shiver down her spine. She didn't speak, couldn't speak. She was too overwhelmed with emotion, with relief, with a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek. I came back, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Just like I promised. I didn't think you would, she whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. I told you I would, he said. And I always keep my promises. Eventually, he told her about his journey, about the places he had been, the people he had met, the things he had seen. He told her about the battles he had fought, both internal and external, the demons he had confronted, the peace he had finally found. I'm not the same man I was when I left, May, he said, his voice earnest. I've changed.
I've grown.
I've learned from my mistakes. I see that, she said, her voice filled with love and admiration. You've become the man I always knew you could be. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. I want to stay, May, he said. If you'll have me, I want to build a life with you. Here, on this ranch. She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears of joy. Of course, I'll have you, Jesse, she said. I've been waiting for you. For a long time. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if he would never let her go. And under the vast, starlit sky, they kissed, a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that promised a future, finally, together. He had come back to stay, and that was all that mattered. He cradled her face and pressed another kiss to her forehead. Chapter 16. Where Trust Lies Broken. The return of Jesse Coulter to Harmony Creek was met with a mixture of reactions. Some welcomed him back with open arms, relieved that he had cleared his name and found some measure of peace. Others remained wary, their memories of his outlaw past still fresh in their minds. Jesse understood their apprehension. He knew he had a lot to prove, that trust was earned, not given. He didn't expect to be welcomed back as a hero. He was prepared to work for it, to demonstrate, through his actions, that he was a changed man. He started by helping his neighbors, offering his skills as a rancher and a horseman. He repaired fences, helped with branding, and shared his knowledge of the land. He was quiet, unassuming, and respectful, slowly earning the respect of a community. But there was one person who remained unconvinced, one person who couldn't forgive him for his past. Silas. Released from jail, Silas returned to his old job at the saloon, but he was a shadow of his former self. The betrayal had taken its toll on him, leaving him bitter and resentful. He avoided Jesse, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and anger whenever their paths crossed. Jesse tried to talk to him, to apologize, to explain, but Silas refused to listen. He had been hurt too deeply, his trust shattered beyond repair. "You used me, Jesse," Silas said, his voice cold and hard. "You used my friendship, my loyalty, to get what you wanted. I can't forgive that." Jesse understood. He knew that some wounds were too deep to heal, that some betrayals were unforgivable. He accepted Silas's rejection, his anger, as the price he had to pay for his past actions. But it still hurt. It hurt to see the hatred in Silas's eyes, to know that he had lost a friend, a mentor, someone he had once looked up to. May tried to comfort him, to tell him that he had done everything he could, that he couldn't force Silas to forgive him.
"You can't change the past, Jesse," she said.
"You can only learn from it and move on."
He knew she was right.
But the weight of his past, the burden of his mistakes, still hung heavy on his shoulders. He wondered if he would ever truly be free, if he would ever be able to escape the shadows of his former life. One day, as he was riding back to the ranch, he saw smoke rising in the distance. He spurred his horse, his heart pounding with a sense of dread. As he drew closer, he saw that it was the saloon, Silas's saloon, that was on fire. The flames had engulfed the structure and were spewing out, lighting up the darkening sky. Chapter 17. Redemption's Dawn. Jesse didn't hesitate. He galloped towards the burning saloon, his mind racing. He knew that Silas was likely inside, trapped by the flames. He had to do something, anything, to help. He dismounted a safe distance away, tying his horse to a post, then ran towards the inferno. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. He could hear the crackling of the flames, the shouts of the townsfolk who had gathered to watch, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. He saw Sheriff Thompson, directing the bucket brigade, trying to contain the fire, but it was too late. The saloon was engulfed in flames, the roof collapsing, sending sparks flying into the night sky. "Silas!" Jesse shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Silas, are you in there?" There was no reply, only the roar of the fire. Jesse knew he couldn't wait. He had to go in. He wrapped a wet cloth around his face, took a deep breath, and plunged into the burning building. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding. He stumbled through the debris, calling out Silas's name, his lungs burning, his eyes stinging. He found him near the back of the saloon, unconscious, pinned beneath a fallen beam. He was badly burned, his clothes smoldering. Jesse struggled to lift the beam, his muscles straining, his body screaming in protest. He managed to free Silas, dragging him out of the inferno, just as the remaining structure collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers. He carried Silas to safety, laying him gently on the ground, away from the heat and the smoke. Sheriff Thompson and the others rushed to his side, tending to his wounds, their faces grim. Jesse collapsed beside him, exhausted, his lungs aching, his body covered in soot and burns. He had done it. He had saved Silas, the man who had betrayed him, the man who hated him. Silas was taken to the town doctor, his condition critical. Jesse waited outside, his anxiety growing with each passing hour. He didn't know if Silas would survive. He didn't know if he had done enough. As the dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, the doctor emerged, his face weary but relieved.
"He's going to make it," he said.
"He's badly burned, but he'll live." "You saved his life, Jesse." Jesse closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him. He had done it. He had redeemed himself, at least in his own eyes. He had faced his past, his demons, and he had emerged victorious. The weight on his shoulders had lifted a bit more. He looked up at the rising sun, a new dawn breaking, a new beginning. He had found his redemption, not in running away, but in facing the fire, in saving the life of the man who had once been his enemy. He glanced back at the smoldering ruins of the saloon, no longer filled with regret and pain. Chapter 18. Scars of the Soul. Silas recovered slowly, his body bearing the scars of the fire, a constant reminder of the night Jesse had saved his life. He was a changed man, humbled by the experience, his anger and resentment replaced by a grudging respect for the man he had once betrayed. He sought Jesse out one day, finding him at the ranch, working in the fields. He approached him hesitantly, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and gratitude. "Jesse," he said, his voice hoarse, his hand trembling. I wanted to thank you for saving my life." Jesse stopped his work, turning to face Silas, his expression unreadable. He had expected this moment, but he still didn't know what to say. "You didn't have to do it," Silas continued, his voice choked with emotion. "After everything I did, you could have let me die." "I couldn't do that, Silas," Jesse said, his voice soft. "I couldn't just stand by and watch you burn."
"Why?"
Silas asked, his eyes searching Jesse's. "Why did you risk your life for me?" Jesse looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Because we all make mistakes, Silas," he said. "And we all deserve a second chance. Even you." Silas nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. I was wrong, Jesse," he said.
"About you."
"About everything. I let greed and fear cloud my judgment. I betrayed a friend. And I almost paid the ultimate price." "It's in the past, Silas," Jesse said, his voice firm. "We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it, and we can move on." Silas extended his hand, his fingers trembling. Can you forgive me, Jesse?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jesse took his hand, his grip firm and steady. "I forgave you a long time ago, Silas," he said. "The moment I pulled you out of that fire." They stood there, two men, scarred by the past, bound by a shared experience, a shared understanding. The forgiveness was unspoken, but it was there, a silent acknowledgement of their shared humanity, their capacity for both good and evil. Silas turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady, his shoulders no longer slumped with shame, but held high with a newfound dignity. He had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild his life, to make amends for his mistakes. Jesse watched him go, a sense of peace settling over him. He had finally closed the circle, reconciled with his past, found forgiveness and redemption. He had faced his demons, and he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. He turned back to his work, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, would always be there, a reminder of the battles he had fought, the lessons he had learned. But they no longer defined him. They were simply a part of his story, a testament to his resilience, his ability to overcome adversity, his capacity for love and forgiveness. The sun had fully risen and he smiled, the past firmly behind him. Chapter 19. The Unforgiving Land. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Jesse and May worked side by side, their love deepening with each passing day, their bond strengthened by the trials they had overcome. They rebuilt the burned-out saloon, turning it into a community gathering place, a symbol of hope and renewal. Harmony Creek, too, began to heal, the scars of the past slowly fading, replaced by a sense of optimism and unity. The town had faced its demons, and it had emerged stronger, more resilient. But the frontier was an unforgiving land, and peace was often a fragile, fleeting thing. A new threat emerged, a band of ruthless outlaws, led by a notorious gunslinger known only as the Serpent. They terrorized the surrounding ranches, stealing livestock, robbing travelers, and leaving a trail of violence and fear in their wake. Sheriff Thompson, his resources stretched thin, appealed to the townsfolk for help. He needed men, experienced riders, who were willing to stand up to the Serpent and his gang. Jesse hesitated. He had vowed to put his outlaw past behind him, to live a peaceful life with May. He didn't want to risk his newfound happiness, his hard-won redemption. But he also knew that he couldn't stand idly by while innocent people were suffering. He had a responsibility, a duty, to use his skills, his experience, to protect his community. He looked at May, his eyes filled with uncertainty.
"I don't know what to do," he said. "I don't want to go back to that life.
But I can't just sit here and do nothing." May understood. She knew that Jesse was a man of action, a man of courage, a man who couldn't turn his back on those in need. She also knew that she couldn't ask him to, that she wouldn't want him to. "You have to do what you think is right, Jesse," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with love and support. "I'll be here, waiting for you, always." He kissed her then, a long, passionate kiss that conveyed his love, his gratitude, his commitment. He knew that he was lucky to have her, that she was his anchor, his strength, his guiding star. He joined Sheriff Thompson and a small group of volunteers, riding out to confront the serpent and his gang. It was a dangerous mission, a gamble, but he was prepared to risk everything to protect his community, to defend the life he had so painstakingly built. He rode with purpose, his past no longer a burden, but a source of strength, a reminder of the lessons he had learned, the battles he had fought. He was no longer an outlaw, running from the law, but a man of the law, riding towards justice, towards a future where peace and security reigned. He rode into the harsh sun, prepared to protect his home. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The showdown took place in a desolate canyon, a natural amphitheater of rock and dust. The serpent and his gang were holed up in a narrow passage, their positions seemingly impenetrable. Sheriff Thompson and his men, outnumbered and outgunned, were pinned down, their situation desperate. Jesse, using his knowledge of outlaw tactics, devised a plan. He would circle around, climb the canyon walls, and attack the gang from above, creating a diversion that would allow Sheriff Thompson and his men to advance. It was a risky maneuver, a near-suicidal mission, but he was prepared to take the chance. He knew that the lives of his friends, his community, depended on it. He scaled the treacherous cliffs, his hands and feet finding purchase on the narrow ledges, his body pressed against the rough rock. He reached the top, his heart pounding, his muscles aching, his lungs burning. He looked down at the serpent and his gang, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of their campfire. They were confident, arrogant, unaware of the danger that lurked above them. He took a deep breath, drew his gun, and opened fire. The surprise was complete. The outlaws, caught off guard, scrambled for cover, their shots wild and inaccurate. Jesse, using the element of surprise to his advantage, picked them off one by one, his aim steady, his movements precise. Sheriff Thompson and his men, hearing the gunfire from above, seized the opportunity. They charged forward, their courage renewed, their determination fueled by Jesse's bravery. The battle was fierce, brutal, but short-lived. The serpent and his gang, overwhelmed and outmaneuvered, were quickly defeated. Some were killed, others captured, their reign of terror brought to an end. Jesse, his body battered and bruised, his clothes torn and dusty, emerged from the canyon, his guns still smoking. He was greeted with cheers, with gratitude, with the respect of the men he had fought alongside. Sheriff Thompson clapped him on the back, his eyes filled with admiration.
"You saved us, Jesse," he said. "You saved the town."
"You're a hero." Jesse shook his head. "I'm no hero, Sheriff," he said. "I just did what I had to do." He looked around at the faces of his friends, his neighbors, the people he had sworn to protect. He saw their relief, their gratitude, their newfound sense of security. And he knew that he had finally, truly, redeemed himself. He had faced his past, his demons, and he had emerged victorious. He was no longer an outlaw, a fugitive, a shadow of his former self. He was a man of honor, a man of courage, a man of the community. He returned to the ranch, to May, his heart filled with a profound sense of peace, of fulfillment. He had found his place in the world, his purpose in life. He had found his home. He was covered in dust, grime, and scrapes, but as she embraced him, all he felt was her love. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the land, he stood with May on the porch, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts beating as one. They had faced the unforgiving land, the challenges of the frontier, and they had emerged stronger. Their love deepened, their bond unbreakable. The final confrontation had been not just with the serpent and his gang, but with the ghosts of his past, with the doubts and fears that had haunted him for so long. And he had won. He had found his redemption, his peace, his future, in the heart of the woman he loved, in the embrace of the community he had sworn to protect. The sky began to darken, ready for another peaceful night. Epilogue. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons, the slow, steady rhythm of life on the frontier. Jesse and May built a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of honest work. The ranch prospered, their family grew, and their home became a haven of warmth and welcome. Children played in the fields, their laughter echoing through the air, a testament to the enduring power of love and resilience. Grandchildren followed, their tiny hands clinging to Jesse's calloused fingers, their eyes wide with wonder as he told them stories of the Old West, stories of outlaws and heroes, of courage and redemption. He never forgot his past, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned. But he no longer dwelled on it, no longer allowed it to define him. He had moved on, embraced the future, and built a life that was a testament to his strength, his determination, and his unwavering love for May. Silas, his body forever marked by the scars of the fire, became a regular visitor to the ranch, his initial awkwardness gradually replaced by a genuine friendship, a bond forged in the crucible of shared experience and forgiveness. He would often sit on the porch with Jesse and May, sharing stories, reminiscing about the past, and marveling at the twists and turns of fate that had brought them together. Harmony Creek thrived, a testament to the spirit of its inhabitants, their ability to overcome adversity, their unwavering commitment to community. The saloon, rebuilt and renamed the Second Chance, became a symbol of hope and renewal, a gathering place where old wounds were healed, new friendships were forged, and the stories of the past were told and retold. And as the sun set each day, casting a golden glow over the land, Jesse and May would sit on the porch, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude. They had faced the storms, weathered the challenges, and emerged stronger. Their love deepened, their bond unbreakable. They had found their paradise, their peace, their forever, in the heart of the unforgiving land, in the embrace of each other's love, in the quiet, enduring beauty of the Western frontier. They had built a legacy, a testament to the power of forgiveness, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring promise of a new beginning. They had lived a long life, a life worthy of the stories once told about them, a life they created together. Their final days were a comfort, a calm joy. It was a fitting end to a tale of the West.